Please welcome from the northern province of Essex, Mass, Whitney Connolly. Where are you, Whitney? Is that you? Come on up here.
Okay, so has anyone else out there spent maybe a little too much time wondering, like, what the fuck is wrong with me? Okay, so maybe a couple of you. So that has basically been kind of the soundtrack to the background of my life since I can remember. And a few years ago, I started making a little headway on the question of what the fuck is wrong with me when I stumbled upon an article about misophonia. And if you don't know what misophonia is, I had never heard of it. It's described as a strong aversion or a strong dislike of certain sounds. For me, my trigger sounds are mostly mouth noises like chewing or snoring or breathing. And scientists didn't really study misophonia until about the last decade. And what they did was they took a bunch of people who described having an irrationally angry response to certain sounds, and they hooked them up to their fancy brain mapping machines. And then they exposed them to those certain sounds, and then they watched what happened to their brain. And the part of the brain that lit up wasn't like the angry, frustrated, irrational side. It was actually the very primal fight or flight area of the brain. And so what that means basically is, as someone with misophonia, when I'm sitting in a board meeting at work and the guy across from me starts chewing gum really loudly, I think a lion is chasing me. Like, that's what my brain does. And it's not really socially acceptable to jump across the desk and start punching him. And it's also not really socially acceptable to just jump up and run screaming from the room. And it's not even really socially acceptable to ask him to stop chewing gum that way. So what happens is I just sit there, and it feels like my brain is kind of melting down the back of my spine. And as my brain tries to regulate itself, what happens is I fantasize about that person's death, right? So like immediately my brain is going, I could push him out this window of this 7-story building, and then I could watch him fall to his death. And upon completing that horrific fantasy, the next thought in my brain is, what the fuck is wrong with me? And until I read that article, I literally just thought I was a really terrible person. And what it turned out, as it turned out, it wasn't as much a character flaw as just my brain is wired really differently. And so I started reading a bunch of articles about misophonia, which led me to a bunch of articles about sensory processing disorders, which led me to a bunch of articles about different types of neurodivergence. And the question became less like, what the fuck is wrong with me, and more, what specific brand of neurodivergent am I exactly? And so I started reading more articles. I started taking online tests, and like clinical doctor recommended online tests, not like BuzzFeed, like, what Taylor Swift era are you? Although I have taken that test, and I am Speak Now, in case you were wondering. And as I started taking these tests and as I started reading these articles, I started kind of feeling like I was getting to the bottom of things. And last week, my friend Billy asked me to be on his podcast. And the premise of his podcast is that he just has friends come on and he interviews them. It's very simple. But the one thing that he asks is that every guest bring a top 5 list. So you arrive with a top 5 list. It can be about anything that you want. I'm turning 40 in May, and I'm actually very excited about it. But as with kind of the lead up to any major milestone birthday, it comes with a little bit of reflection. So I thought what might be really fun to do is a top 5 list of things that I never expected to have as a 40-year-old woman. And most of the things on the list were funny, like a second husband, or a house in Massachusetts, because I grew up in New Hampshire, and there is a rivalry. But as we were approaching the number one thing on my list, I realized that I was getting really nervous, and I was getting really sweaty, and I was thinking to myself, like, I don't know if I can say this. I don't know if I can speak these words, and I was trying to figure out kind of why that was happening. And I think mostly because I'm kind of still in this world of self-discovery, and I haven't met with a clinical psychologist. I don't have any sort of diagnosis, and so it felt like I wasn't allowed to say the words, but I was brave, and I said them, and I am equally as nervous and sweaty right now, but I'm going to be brave, and I'm going to say them again. And the number one thing that I did not expect to have as a 40-year-old woman is autism. Thank you.
That's Whitney.